Okay, let's have a word of prayer and we'll dive into this. Father God, we come because you have drawn us to yourself in Jesus. And for that, we are deeply thankful. For through him, we have found life and meaning and hope that we found nowhere else. We thank you for your word and your spirit, for the community of faith. We're all active in bringing us to you through Jesus. And we seek your guidance this evening as we look at one element of your word, that we might be guarded and guided by your spirit to see truth, to understand its importance, to honor it, and to follow it. For we come in the name of our Savior, in Jesus the Messiah. Amen. Here you have a chart that he's using to review the various theories that have been developed to show how the Israelites move from Egypt to Palestine. And you'll notice they vary considerably. Let me drop that back and bring up a map. Where you can see a little bit of that variety. Let's look at this one. The one on the right doesn't have any routes marked on it like the one on the left. And you can see where the basic area that's involved. The traditional route comes down the west side of the Sinai and then goes up the east side of the Sinai, then wanders around in here, and then goes on the east side of the Dead Sea and up to enter the Promised Land. That's the traditional route that you will find. The variations on that is how far north that comes. And so you have some routes, there's pretty good consensus that they all start up here in this northeastern part of the delta. And then the routes vary as to where they come through the Sinai. And rather than coming all the way down the west side, there are routes that take it through the center in various ways. And then the two major variations to that are the variation that moves not just in the Sinai, but actually crosses over into the Midian area of Arabia and finds the various activities over here. And then the third possibility does not come into the Sinai at all, but stays up here in the north part of the Sinai and back over into Arabia up on the north, not on the south. So those are the major variations. Those that move this over here generally agree that the crossing of the quote Red Sea, which is the way the tradition brought it to us, and we'll look at that in just a minute, that crossing occurs somewhere over here on the Gulf of Aqaba, not somewhere on the west side of Sinai, somewhere up in this area where the Suez Canal now is, the Bitter Lakes. There are several smaller bodies of water up in this area, or even down in here in the Gulf of Suez. And the major reason why you have all of this variety is that there is no consensus as to where these various places are. Now, on this map, what you have are the current names. So those places are there. How these relate to the names that we have in the Bible story is the discussion, is the disagreement. And you've received several different documents today that add to this document that I sent you last week that discuss the reasons why they think they follow the system they do that takes you down here, takes you through here, takes you across into Midian, leads you clear up here in the north. And they all try to follow what they understand the progress to be, the time span involved to get from one place to another. The fundamental reason why these, of course, aren't known for sure is that those names were not retained in any tradition. So there was no connection between the names that we have in the Bible story and actual physical locations. All those connections are based on a whole variety of suppositions over which there's considerable obvious disagreement. That list that I showed you before, and let me show you another list. Drop this for a minute, and we'll go back to another list that I think I was able to get up. Yes, here it is. The main location, of course, that is of a major importance in the story is Mount Sinai, or as in some of the biblical records, it's called Horeb. Again, a difference. And this list is composed of various places. Here's the traditional place in southern Sinai. Here's one of the places in the north. Here's one in central Sinai. And here's one across in Arabia, Sinai in Arabia. And in these cases, and here's the northern one in the land of Edom. And in this list, as in the other list, most all the names that these two lists have are major scholars. These aren't popular desktop archaeologists or some researcher who's made this a hobby. These are all major scholars who thoroughly familiar with the material, with the geography. They've been to these places. And here's the difference. One of the real differences is the fact that you have two major lists one in Numbers, one in Deuteronomy for the trip. They don't have the same names. A lot of the names overlap, but they don't agree all the way through. How do we explain that? As we already mentioned, Sinai in Deuteronomy is always Horeb, not Sinai. Um, Proposals for what's the difference? One's a mountain range, the other is the actual peak. Um, that might solve the problem, but there's clearly a difference even in the biblical material. And so we're confronted with two separate problems. One has to do with the biblical record, and then one has to do with the actual geography that we have and the history that we have about that in the Bible times. And that creates a second set of problems because there isn't agreement on where that is. Let me see if I can bring that article up so you get a quick little survey of it. That article is not showing. Let me see if I can wrangle it in right quick. I don't know why these aren't showing. Here we go. Let me modify this and see if I can get it come up. Okay, now let's see if it'll come up. Um, Getting more interference. Okay, let's see if it shows up now. Um, Here you have the what's known as the minimalist view that this early history in the Bible is all biblical narrative developed as an explanation for Israel in the days of probably Ezra, Nehemiah, in the 7th century or even the 6th century. And the major argument of that, of course, is that it's difficult to find anything in Egypt that corresponds archaeologically to the story in Genesis about the period and about the Exodus, nor is there a similar archaeological basis that matches up in Palestine for an entrance and a conquest as described in Joshua. And this article will lead you through that problem. And two of the other articles will look at this same problem, because there's not only the issue of the archaeological evidence that's being regulated and controlled to a certain degree by how things are being dated. And so now there's more discussion being developed in terms of when we actually have to date the Exodus. The old traditional date puts it in the 14th or 15th century, the 1400s or the 1500 of the 1300s or the 1400s before Christ. The current scholarly model puts it in the 13th century, the 1200s, in one way or another. And again, there's no easy consensus for how we deal with that presence of evidence and lack of evidence. And so that's up in the air. And when you read these articles, you'll see this from both sides and various modifications in between. One of the articles I sent you is done by an Egyptologist who argues pretty persuasively that the evidence, the earliest firm evidence we have in Egypt of Israel in an inscription means by the dating that it's involved, that they couldn't have waited until the very early 1200s or late 1300s to go there, because they're already an established force when this is written in the 1200s. So they must have been there earlier. Well, no. How do you deal with that? One of the articles I sent you argues this from the standpoint of the biblical text itself. How do we understand these narratives? To what degree are they literary? To what degree are they historical? And among the scholars, you find the word that builds on histories. History is what really happened. The historiological way is where it's reported. And when you read that article, you'll see part of the problem. And probably the most helpful way of introducing that is something you're far more familiar with. Do you have your Bibles that you can look at? Turn in your Bible to the book of Mark. It would help if your Bible happens to have paragraph headings, but they won't be essential. In the first chapter, you're introduced to Jesus at his baptism. In chapter 2, he goes to the city of Capernaum, and you have several events recorded there. Couple of healings. And then in chapter 3, end of you have the
Where we at?
rooftop healing. The man is let through the roof.
We're in Mark. He's on Mark 1 and 2.
Yes, you're in Mark.
Okay.
Toward the end of chapter 3, he chooses the 12.
In Mark, honey?
In Mark chapter 3, Jesus chooses them 12 in verse 13. In chapter 4, he begins to teach by the sea. And he has some parables. The end of chapter 4, he crosses the sea, and you have the stilling of the storm. In chapter 5, you have the Gadarene demoniac being healed. He crosses back over the sea, and he heals Jairus's daughter and the woman with a hemorrhage. And in chapter 6, he's rejected at Nazareth. He went to his own country.
You said he healed Jairus' daughter and the
Yes,
son?
in chapter 5,
Mhm.
beginning in verse 21. He crosses back over from Gadara, from Decapolis, and he's met by Jairus. And on the way to raise his daughter, of course, he starts out, he's asked to heal her because she's just sick, but she dies before he gets there. He heals the woman with hemorrhage. And in chapter 6, so you've had probably 15, 20 episodes when you get to Nazareth in chapter 6. Now go to the book of Luke. Which has the birth story that Mark didn't have at all, and the visit to the temple that Mark didn't have, and the trip to Jerusalem when he was around 12, which Mark didn't have. So in chapter 3 of Luke, you have the ministry of John and the baptism of Jesus. And then you have a long genealogy that closes out chapter 3. Chapter 4, you have the temptation, which just took a couple of verses in Mark. And then in verse 14 of chapter 4 of Luke, you have Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and fame went out through all the region round him, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified of all. And he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up. and then went to the synagogue as was usual, read from Isaiah, and said, this is being fulfilled. In Luke, Jesus' visit to Nazareth is at the very beginning of his ministry. In Mark, it doesn't come till chapter 6, after a couple of dozen things have been told. And of course, you get a clue in Luke that more things have happened than Luke has told you about, because in the discussion that's involved, remember, Jesus insists, you'll probably say, tell me, physician, you ought to heal yourself. What we've heard you've done in Capernaum, you ought to do here too. So Luke lets you know that Jesus already done some things in Capernaum, even though he hadn't told you about that. So biblical narrative is not often, or not always, chronological. The writers have various purposes in mind in the way they tell the story. They may recapitulate a story. They may retell a story. They may locate a story in conjunction with a related story or location or person that's out of sequence. So looking back at the map again, I'll use a different one this time. What's a major problem with this idea that they would have crossed the Red Sea down here somewhere in the Gulf of Aqaba over into Arabia, not up here in eastern Egypt, somewhere above the Gulf of Suez? What's a major problem with that? The story comes very early. This episode becomes very early in this story. This is a little trek down through here. This takes several days to get from up here to clear down to the bottom of Sinai. And yet the crossing occurs very early in the story. Is that chronological, or is that topical emphasis? This was the critical event in their exodus. Would the writer feel comfortable moving it to the early part of the story, even though it happened chronologically later in the story, like Luke did the Nazareth visit of Jesus? Let me drop that and take you to this article that gives you an idea of that kind of thing. A Bible scholar looks at biblical archaeology's coverage of the Exodus. And he points out the lack of archaeological evidence, And here you have his use of the word historiography at the bottom. How they tell the history, how they tell the story is involved with their purpose. And then he gives a couple of examples of how the Bible writers apparently are showing their use of narrative to point out various things that are not necessarily in the order that we would expect them to be. And what's fascinating about this is that a number of recent developments have come as people with experience in literature have gone back to the Bible, and particularly people with ancient literature. They weren't schooled in the Bible. They became scholars of Near Eastern history or Egyptology or Assyriology or even up to the Greek and Roman time, and backdoor came into the Bible. And they came with this literary background of contemporary literature and found the Bible scholars talking about problems in the Bible text that they recognized immediately as simply literary devices that they're perfectly familiar with and comfortable with in contemporary literature. They don't see it as a problem at all. They wrote stories this way. They told stories this way. I ran across one just last week in 2 Kings. There's a story of a king, and you have a very, very short snippet about his becoming king, and his characterization by the author wasn't very good because he maintained some of the idolatry, and he died, and his son took his place, and he's ready to move on. But before he moves on, he goes back and tells a story about this king before he died. And one of the people suggests that this was deliberate so that when you read this story about how he relates to what turns out to be the dead prophet, you understand that when this happens, he's already dead himself. The writer's trying to make you see something that is not obvious by the way he tells the story. And so we're caught between two areas with which we have a significant distance. We're dealing with a literature told in an entirely different cultural environment with entirely different language. And then we're dealing with a geography that is equally different because it's changed. One of the major problems of the evidence of Israel, of the Hebrews in Egypt to be led out by Moses is that, as we mentioned before, there's almost no evidence there. Well, part of that is expected because where we're told they live, and there's pretty solid agreement on that, is up here in this area. This is all delta. This has all been formed by the Nile River, which is right over in here. These are tributaries coming off of the major Nile River. All of this area in here. So to excavate it, you have to dig a pit and put in pumps and pump the water out because this is all, even what's hard, even what's land is got water almost at the surface. And a lot of it is still marsh. And the delta out here on the Mediterranean Sea is miles from where it was 2,000 years ago, because this delta has continued to form all of these years. So we should be surprised that we're having trouble locating where these places were then. And historically, we know that major cities that appear in the story with of Exodus don't last very long in terms of the capital city and the important places for Egypt, because they soon move. And Egypt history is familiar with the fact that these disappear. One of the arguments for the validity of the Bible narrative is the fact that these cities in Egypt that are mentioned in the biblical narrative don't even exist in the 7th century, when certain scholars want to have this story constructed. Well, 7th century writers would hardly have known about some of these cities in Egypt in the 12th, let alone the 13th or the 14th century. So how do they know these names? Unless they're doing the story. An even firmer piece of evidence that I heard about a couple of years ago, the Exodus story, remember, tells about the birth of the Hebrew babies that the Egyptian midwives are supposed to kill, the boys. And the story mentions a birth brick. Apparently, there was a custom that a brick, a rock, or something was placed under the woman when the baby was born. And Egyptologists know this now as a practice in Egypt in those prior to 1000 history. But it soon stopped. By 700, it's not been happening in Egypt for several hundred years. How did the Bible writer of 700 invent this story and knew about that custom long ago? So you can't just dismiss the story. So we're stuck with dealing with story that challenges us, historiography of both the Egyptians and the Israelites that challenge us, and geography that's changed. And thus, we shouldn't be surprised when we have difficulties, when we have different opinions as to how this actually worked out. And so you're going to have a series of articles that take you from up here across here. See, here's one that comes pretty far north and then comes down here on the east side of the Sinai to a place they're going to call Mount Sinai. And you'll recognize that's considerably north, because this map doesn't even have that place clear down there at the pit, at the peak of the peninsula. I found it intriguing that one of these articles starts out by asking the question, Why the outstanding obscurity about Mount Sinai and the route? And remember, last week I already suggested my answer to that. Is that God didn't want to put us in the place of having any significant value of those places. He didn't want to feel and want us to feel any obligation, any enhanced value if we went to that place. If we did, like, as I mentioned, Elijah, who went back to Mount Horeb after his price being set on his head and he finding a dangerous situation in Israel. Well, you can go back to the place, but you're not going to find it like Moses did. God's not going to necessarily treat you like he did Moses. So there's no real value to worry about that, to make the effort. But in spite of the fact, you see, we people have found it really hard to resist the desire to try to go back to the place. And so we've made all of these efforts to try to find the place. And we've created a real industry in taking you to the place. We've mentioned a couple of times the issue with what the place is called where they crossed the water. The tradition is the Red Sea, which is here and here. The two arms, the Gulf of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez. And the argument that you find in numerous articles that the Hebrew word that's used here is not the word for red. It's a word that seems to be related to the Egyptian word for reed. And so you will find even a couple of translators now want to translate the story, the Sea of Reeds or the Reed Sea. You will find in one of the discussions, the point being made that that doesn't jibe completely with what the Bible writers do, because later Bible writers or Bible writers writing about later things use the same word in clear reference to the Red Sea. In one particular case, the Gulf of Aqaba, because it's where Solomon sets up a base of operation. And in the context, it's perfectly clear he's talking about this area above at the end of the Gulf of Aqaba. But they're using the same word. And another indication of we have to constantly be aware of the fact that we have to pay attention to how the Bible writers use a word, not what even we have been able to determine pretty certainly is its origin, its original meaning and etymology, but how are they using it? And so you can't totally dismiss the Red Sea terminology if, in fact, the Bible writers seem to use that word that way. That doesn't necessarily prove that it was down here or over here and not up at one of the bodies of water in the marshy area on the east side of Egypt. It just says we can't be certain. So we have to consider what those people who have really worked at this, spent a lot of time on it, what proposals they have presented, and aware that that's not the only possible conclusion. Okay, question? That map didn't come up, did it?
Yeah,
It did? Okay.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. Mine's from, is this renew showing up on for you? Is
the
there a,
what?
is there a block over the map for you all?
Block?
Yeah, a big white block over the map.
no.
Good. That's only on my computer. That's what I'm hoping. Um, okay, I'm done. Here's one of those that shows the into Arabia. And when you compare those, you'll discover that there's not consensus as to which of these peaks down in this corner of Arabia is Mount Sinai. Nor will you find consensus over where they actually cross here. Let me see if I can find a map. I don't think I've got one that shows one of those extreme northern routes that I can bring up. No. Let me see if I've got one here that I may can finagle out. Oh, that one I have. Where you go? Here we go. You can see on this map, um, between the Gulf of Aqaba and the Dead Sea, on the right-hand side, wilderness of Zin and Petra, and Kadesh Barnea, where some of the events at the end take place. This is the area that those who propose the most northern route even see Mount Sinai up in this area. In the Petra region. And that was on that list that I showed you of the location of Mount Sinai. And one of them said near Petra. So you've gone from here clear up to here. And notice this route on this map, when they go into, this one takes you into Arabia. Look how far into Arabia it takes you. Whereas the other one just went into here and then went up. This is in some of the material that I sent you. This is one of the maps that's in there. Okay, now I use this particular problem both in terms of the geography and the problem we have with geography, in that even those sites that are most consensus on are the result of centuries of tradition and various studies. So even in the New Testament, we have some of the same problem as to where these events of Jesus occur. Let me go down to this one. And one of those happens to be the baptism of Jesus. If you look on a lot of maps, they will show the baptism of Jesus down by the Dead Sea area, north of the Dead Sea somewhere, not too far away. And we preachers can make a lot out of that because you see, Jesus had to come from up here in Galilee all the way down here to be baptized. So you don't have an excuse. But one of the things that's argued now is there is considerable opinion that John's ministry was actually happening up here in the north. And there are scholars who are willing to argue that with great strength. Because for them, there is both the biblical evidence and the historical and archaeological evidence. So don't be surprised when you find in a Bible dictionary, a commentary, certainly an online discussion article of some kind, where somebody is willing to argue with great persuasion that a historical site, which you've never heard mentioned in that place before, he now will argue that it was there. Not at all where you thought it was, or have been told it was. Because the evidence that we have is not ironclad in way too many places. One of the arguments over the Exodus issue, where it ends, is where was Jericho? And the argument has been made that the site that we now identify as Jericho didn't even exist at the time we think Moses got there, or Joshua got there. Well, maybe that's because we have our dates wrong. Maybe it's because we have the wrong place. And so on all of this issue of geography and the history related to it, you are constantly having the opportunity to find something new, a new idea that in many respects may make good sense. Until some other scholar comes along and says, yeah, but if that's true, then this, and then that's a problem. And then we're stuck with another problem, a different problem. And that's the nature of the animal. That's just what we're stuck with, because these things happened at least 3,000 years ago. And everything's changed. A lot of things have changed since then, even geographically. So always be ready to think about what you're reading when they're making specific claims about exact locations and the process. And the second reason for doing that, using this particular one, is because not only involves the geography, it involves the history. And our understanding of the history is three-pronged: the biblical record, the contemporary records, and then the historiography that's developed from those two things and the traditions that have come with it. So you actually have three streams of information that's always wrestling with each other. When we're dealing with history. And history, of course, includes the people. So when we're dealing with people, that's the same issue. So for next week, don't worry about the geography, except when it wakes you in the middle of the night and you have to fret over it for a little while. Think about the history. Pick an event in the Old Testament, and I'm going to give you an event to go with it to look at. The division of the kingdom of Solomon at his death. The tribes are not happy with how his son is ruling, and so they break off. Look at that history and see what you find in the sources that you've worked with so far. And we'll add a third source, and I'll send you a couple of items on a bibliography for that. Because when you're dealing with this, you're dealing with the history that's recorded for us in Kings and Chronicles. So you've got two different sources in the Bible for this story, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the story of Jesus. See what you find for this story.
It's dealing with the kings and what else?
The kings, and mainly the kings who follow Solomon, David's son, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. One is his son, and one is an alternative to his son that some of the tribes take as their king. And you'll have both this story in the Bible itself, but on those kings, you'll have then sources in the Bible dictionary or any other Bible help that you find, as well as online sources that talk about those two kings. Okay? And obviously, there'll be some geography involved because those kings are ruling places. So some of the information we'll talk about what the scope of their rule was. So you have not just history, but you still have a little tinge of geography in that discussion. And that'll introduce you to not only the history, but two personages, which then open the door for how we can look at people. So those are what we're going to be doing the next few weeks. Okay? Anybody have anything you want to mention? question? Anybody else show up for class?
Yes, Dion,
Yes.
Dee
Yes,
and Andy's here.
yes, ma'am. Got
We
you.
showed up late.
That's all right. We got you.
Okay.
All right. Y'all
Good
have
night.
the rest of the evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.